Section 2 of the Western Boundary and Other Essays by Helmuth von Moltke, translated by Charles Flint McClumpher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. The Western Boundary, Part 1. Since in France the claims on the boundary of the Rhine are traditional, and since these on every occasion, and with the approval of all parties, are made to appear as if France has to recall an ancient valid privilege which Germany retains, to redress a heavy loss which Germany inflicts upon it, to restore the natural boundaries which Germany has broken through in an unnatural and unlawful manner. Since this is the dominant conviction in France, and since not only ambitious ministers like Thiers and young republicans, but also loyal peers like the Duke of Noailles and gentle poets like Lamartine have loudly and equally bona fide given utterance to the same opinion, it is high time to submit these French claims, once and for all, to a purely historical examination. We shall be as brief as possible, yet we must turn to the history of early times, pretty far back, in order to establish clearly the boundary relations of France to Germany. The Gauls, who formerly inhabited the country now called France, were conquered by the great Caesar about the middle of the 1st century before Christ. For 500 years they continued to be subjects of the Roman Caesars. They accepted the language, customs, religion, science, and art of the Romans, and at the same time all the vices of the later period of the empire. In the same epoch in which Gaul was subjugated by the Romans, the ancient Roman Republic came to an end, and the despotic and gradually degenerating government of the emperors began. At the end of this epoch, Gaul shared the misery of slavery and the worst demoralization with all the other Roman provinces. Ecclesiastical and profane writers of that period, whose works have been preserved for us, vie with one another in giving the most shocking descriptions of it. Especially do they complain of the Gauls' mania for theatre, who, in the midst of the murder and the conflagration accompanying the migration of the nations, stand upon the ruins of their cities and continue to cry for plays. And the frivolity of their morals was such that all indulged in licentious desires, without regard to age or blood relationship. Every trace of political freedom and honour had disappeared, to such an extent that, at the dissolution of the empire, there was no class, no corporation to be found which could or would have established a new political order. There were only slaves left, who were distributed among a few rich satraps. We think that these facts should be mentioned first, because the French, since the last century, have laboured under the delusion that they are the direct descendants and heirs of ancient republicanism. They maintain that their revolution is a restoration of that ancient civil liberty, a reaction of democratic Romanism or Latinism against aristocratic Germanism, an emancipation of the ancient Roman Gallic population from the yoke of the German conquerors or from the Franconian feudal lords. In this sense they have sought to banish all remembrances of the Franks. They have revived in their new republic the names of the ancient Roman Republic, the Senate, the consuls. To this end Napoleon also acted when he, like the emperors of ancient Rome, gave back the conquered land the oldest names, such as Liguria, Cisalpinia, Helvetia, Belgium, Batavia, etc. Napoleon acted consistently in doing this, but the republicans were certainly wrong in terming themselves the heirs of the freedom of ancient Rome, as Gaul had never known this very thing, nor did it come under Roman rule until after freedom had been carried to its grave. By the Romans the Gauls were robbed of all freedom. They were unnationalized, unnerved. They received their freedom back again first from the German conquerors, and their morals were improved. While the Romans succeeded in a short time in completely subjugating the Gauls, they did not succeed in doing the same with the Germans. The Germans, or Deutschen, knew how to maintain their freedom and independence against all attacks on the part of the Roman Empire, and they struggled vigorously for 500 years against the superior power of Rome. a period equally as long as that during which the Gauls were the slaves of Rome. At last the Germans conquered, destroyed the Roman Empire, and also gained a victory over Gaul. The settlement of German conquerors in Gaul was equally fortunate and salutary for the Gaul, as that of the Romans had been unfortunate and harmful for them. Through the Romans they had lost their nationality, independence, freedom, good morals, and healthy existence. Through the Germans these same were restored to them. It was first by the fusion of the Slavish population sunken in vice with the free and strong Franks, Goths, and Burgundians that healthful life returned to the people of Gaul, a new national honour, and a new state of justice established upon freedom. The vanquished were treated with forbearance and received privileges which they had never possessed under the Romans. Soon they shared in all the privileges of the conquerors and in the duties of government. They soon accustomed themselves to the new constitutional liberty which the Franks had brought to them. Not only the Franks but the Roman Gauls also appeared upon the field of Mars, and sat in the council of the constitutional kings, bound by election and agreement. Therefore Montesquieu rightly says, freedom is a gift which the Franks brought to Gaul from the Germanic forests. But the French of today are seeking to forget this beautiful and true saying of Montesquieu, and are unwilling to be reminded of it. Gaul received still more benefices from the Germans. In the beginning of the 8th century, the Mohammedans conquered Spain, and in innumerable bands they pressed beyond the Pyrenees. The new Frankish Empire in Gaul was not yet fully established. The Roman language was spoken so generally that Germanic ability was not yet able to vanquish all forms of weakness. Therefore western France submitted to the Crescent, and would have been completely subjected and converted to the faith of the Mussulman, had it not been saved by the armed forces of Rhine Franks, Swabians, Bavarians, and Thuringians. In the 9th century Germany was separated from France as an empire under Louis the German. France was made a kingdom by itself under Charles the Bald. Now it is noticeable, and special weight should be placed upon it, that the German emperors, though far more powerful than the French kings, always preserved friendship with France, and never planned to disturb or to weaken it. How fortunate it was for France that it was always spared most on its weakest side by its strongest neighbour, and was at no time disturbed in its development. It was natural that at that time, moreover, the little French kingdom should occupy a place subordinate to the great German Empire. The Germans were the lords of the universe. What were the Gauls to them? The Germans had shattered the yoke of Rome. They had opposed a brazen wall to Islamism. They had awakened new life in the ancient Roman provinces of England, France, and Italy. They had laid a new foundation for state constitutionality, civil freedom, prosperity, and honour. On the other hand, what had the Gauls done? They had, as former slaves of Rome, as a vanquished people, received only the benefits which the German conquerors had generously granted them. They remained passive. The Germans alone possessed the energy. Everything that was done to transform the ancient, degraded, degenerated Gaul into new salutary and flourishing France was done by the Germans. Under such circumstances, indeed, it could not have occurred to the Gauls to be willing to measure their strength with the Germans, or to claim political equality. That the German Empire must have been much greater and more powerful than the French kingdom was a matter of course. The Gauls enjoyed their new freedom and independence, in truth, only as a gift of the German victors. Just as the complete transformation of the ancient world in the Middle Ages proceeded from the Germans, so there remained also with the Germans the power and evidence of this very same, that is, the crown of the Caesars. And just as the complete conquest of the Roman Empire proceeded from Germany, so the kingdoms of Burgundy and Italy remained incorporated in the German Empire. How could the Gauls have dared to complain of this extension of the German Empire? For they themselves had been vanquished by the Germans, and were emancipated merely by the favour of the same victors. Centuries must elapse before it could ever occur to the modern Frenchmen to measure themselves with the Germans, and to be willing to increase at their expense. The preponderance of the Germans was so well established naturally and historically that it required a long lapse of time till French envy could dare to meddle with the majesty of the German nation. Far into the 13th century, France continued to be bounded by the Garonne, Loire, and Seine, and it was solely by accident that it also came into possession of the German earldom of Flanders, which had come under French fealty through Count Baldwin, the son-in-law of Charles the Bald. But all the rest of the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Lorraine, the free earldom of Burgundy, Franche-Comté, and the whole district of Saône and Rhône, the old kingdom of Burgundy, or Arrelat, belonged to the German Empire. Excepting Flanders, the political boundary of our empire extended far beyond the limits imposed by the language, and this was natural, for since the 5th century all this territory, and even more, the entire early empire of the Romans, was a lawful conquest of the Germans. The boundary made by the language seems to have been determined very soon after the conquest, and it has been retained with few changes up to the present day. Further west or south, the settlements of the German conquerors were thinner and more scattered. Nearer the old home in the east and north, they were more dense. In the former case, the victors accepted the language of the far more numerous vanquished, from whom are derived the various Romance dialects of Spanish, Italian, and French. In the latter case, the victors were superior in numbers, and the German language was retained. The boundary between the German and French linguistic districts begins on the North Sea at Calais, and thence runs almost directly east on a line north of which are the cities Ypres, Courtrai, Rhine, Grammont, Enghien, Brussels, Louvain, Thiers-le-Mont, Saintonge, Tong, Maastricht, and Aachen. And south are the cities Saint-Omer, Lille, Tournai, Ath, Nivelles, Wavre, Joudogne, Liège, and Verviers. From Verviers this boundary suddenly turns south-southwest, passing through Malmedy, Sarm, Uffalise, Bastogne, Rebais, to Virton. From this point it turns again southwest and passes through Longwy, Thionville, that is Diedenhofen, crosses the Moselle at Metz, runs along the watershed between the Moselle and the Saar, always keeping south, as far as the Vosges, meets the same at the sources of the Saar, runs on the back of the Vosges, and strikes southward as far as Altkirch, but from that point it bends somewhat easterly, nearly to the city of Bâle. Then again it turns directly south across the Jura, descends at Biel, and thence follows the course of the Arc and Saône, as far as the High Alps, also mounts these, passes through the middle of the Wallis, and still includes Monterosa, in the province of Savoy, the mountain villages of which have recently attracted the attention of several travellers. From Oberwollis, the boundary extends eastward between the German and Italian borderland of languages, and straight through the middle of the high mountains, with a preponderance of the German element, so far as more German is found to the south of the highest watersheds than to the north of them. We will not follow it exactly, since we propose here to speak only of the frontier opposite France. All peoples west of the boundary line mentioned speak Italian or French, all east of the same German, and this boundary between the languages has been preserved almost unchanged for over a century, as far as the record of history extends. It is obvious, then, that the entire district along the Rhine, both on the left bank as well as the right, during this long era was, and still is, exclusively occupied by the Germans. For the reasons given before, the empire of the Germans still extends far beyond this frontier between the languages, and the claim upon its ancient conquests in the Roman territories cannot be disputed. In the first place, in the 13th century, when that most celebrated family of our emperor, the noble house of the Hohenstaufens, was defeated in that irreconcilable contest with the Roman hierarchy, France, in league with the Pope, dared to meddle with the rights and honour of the German Empire. That empire, without an emperor, disturbed by the intrigues of the Pope, lacerated by civil wars, could not attend to the attacks of its western neighbour. France seized the inheritance of the Hohenstaufens in Naples, and the kingdom of Burgundy on the Rhone, that is, Arrelat, and it was a French prince that ordered the last scion of the Swabian imperial house to fall under the executioner's axe. When one remembers that Gaul owes its restoration and its new flourishing life to the Germans alone, and that Germany never hindered nor even disturbed it in its course of development, France's treatment of our Swabian emperor seems far from honourable. Germany had not deserved that from the hand of France. We shall now only briefly state that France continued its unjust measures, that it placed its princes on both the Neapolitan and the Hungarian thrones in order to surround the German Empire on all sides, that it first formed a league with the Pope, and then soon made a complete slave of him, removed him from Rome to Avignon, kept him in honourable imprisonment, and gradually enforced measures which were eminently disastrous to the German Empire. The whole reign of Emperor Louis of Bavaria was a desperate struggle against the snares and intrigues of the Roman-French League. The wisdom and perseverance of the emperors of the House of Luxembourg first succeeded in dissolving this Roman-French alliance by conducting the Pope back to Rome, and by holding France in check, while at the same time the French dynasties in Naples and Hungary perished through their own vices. Yet a branch of the royal house of France was firmly established between Germany and France. This was the new Duke of Burgundy, who made important acquisitions at the cost of our empire in the 14th and 15th centuries, partly by marriage, partly by inheritance, partly by stratagem, partly by force. Philip and his son Charles the Bold of Burgundy had by these means gained possession of the Franche-Comté, Luxembourg, and the entire German Netherlands. Charles had already secured Alsace for himself by mortgage. Then he planned also to conquer Lorraine and Switzerland, to control the entire left bank of the Rhine, and to assume the title of king. Had he been successful in this plan, the French spirit which held exclusive sway at his court would have acquired extraordinary influence at the expense of the German. Everyone perceived that the Netherlands impatiently wore the yoke of the non-German prince. Bloody revolts of the Flemish and of the citizens of Liège were suppressed only with difficulty. The German Oberland, however, prevented the danger. Alsace rose up in arms, and the provincial governor of the Burgundian ruler was executed by the people at Breisach. Switzerland rose up in arms, and the proud Charles was defeated in a few but very decisive battles. He himself was slain, and his whole inheritance, as far as it consisted of German imperial estates, including Flanders, also passed over to the Austrian house. The rest of the French possessions of the Duchy of Burgundy returned to France. Should France, supported by such reminiscences, wish to make, notwithstanding, some historical claims on Flanders, Germany would be able to reclaim Arras with even more justice. The natural ascendancy of the German Empire was restored, but France was unable to keep the peace. It could no longer resist the desire for unjust conquests, and, as it did not dare to attack Germany itself, it turned against Italy, relying upon the usual slowness of the Germans, who would not hurry themselves to make an effort in Italy's behalf. France had not the slightest right in Italy, for its claim upon Naples, which it had illegally seized from the Hohenstaufens, had to be held by force as a legitimate one. But France desired not merely Naples, but all Upper Italy. It started long, bloody, and desolating wars, without any just cause, purely from avarice. It did not, however, attain its object. Its king was imprisoned and dishonoured at Paris. The German Emperor Charles V continued to rule in Italy as in Spain, which he had inherited. Yet he made his political mistake in dividing his great possessions, in tearing all the Netherlands and the free earldom of Burgundy from the German Empire, and giving them, together with Naples and Milan, to his son Philip II of Spain, while his brother Ferdinand received only the rest. Simultaneous with this began the great German Reformation, and unfortunately the divisions which rent our empire soon gave France a new opportunity for brigandage. The Protestants were defeated in the Schmalkalden War. Prince Maurice of Saxony, who, until now, had fought on the Emperor's side against the Protestants, then committed his famous act of treason, and allied himself with France for the Protestant cause against the Emperor. King Henry II of France broke down the frontier of the empire, sending before him a revolutionary manifest which proclaimed freedom for the Germans and was symbolically adorned with a liberty cap and a dagger. Who gave him the right to summon the Germans to revolt against their emperor? The German emperors had never interfered in the internal affairs of France. To be sure, Henry II was invited by Prince Maurice, but is it international law to accept the invitation of a revolutionist in order to disturb a neighbouring country? Henry II wished to save the liberty of the Germans, moreover their religious liberty, but was he actually in earnest about it? He himself was a Catholic, and continued to be Catholic, and such a fanatical one that he ordered all the converts to the Lutheran faith in France to be burned alive, and he was personally present at these auto-da-fés. While he hoped to befool the Germans with a gross lie, namely, that he was acting for the rescue of their religious liberty, he intended nothing else than to make some conquests in German territory, which was powerless to oppose him because of the general chaos in the empire. By stratagem and by force he gained possession of the 3 cities and bishoprics of Metz, Toul, and Verdun, and he was permitted to hold them, for the Germans were disunited and fighting with one another, instead of uniting their strength to oppose the enemy of the empire. Metz, till now a free German imperial city, subsequently became inclined to Lutheranism, lost its ancient freedom, and was changed into a French provincial city. Also the religious liberty, for which the king feigned to contend, was wholly suppressed. The Lutheran confession of faith was forbidden on pain of death. The deadly hatred of both church parties in Germany increased still more, and at last broke out in that long struggle which, under the name of the 30 Years' War, left such a direful record. Sweden and France took part in this great civil war of the Germans, both under the pretext of giving the Protestants assistance against the emperor, but really for the purpose of making conquests in Germany. Sweden can produce much to excuse its part. Recent historians of the Germans have been, indeed, too generous with their reproaches for the King Gustavus Adolphus. He desired to make conquests. He had indeed the bold plan to become German emperor. Very well, we do not doubt it. But if he had accomplished his plan, would it have been a misfortune for us? He was a prince of Germanic ancestry. He would have become so German that Sweden would soon have been regarded only as a German province. Besides, he was in earnest in his struggle for religious liberty. He was born and bred a Protestant, and thoroughly convinced with the truth, which at that time was about to be suppressed. Was some political ambition intermingled with his sentiments? Who can declare that the piety of this noble king was merely a mask? It certainly was not. His memory must continue to be sacred to all Protestants. Thus Sweden was justified in interfering in the 30 Years' War, in assisting the hard-pressed Protestants. But France, what then did France wish? At the head of this kingdom stood a cardinal, and next to him a Capuchin, the notorious Father Joseph, who in the name of the king, not yet of age, held sway. A cardinal and a monk. Could they have meant honesty with the cause of the Protestants? And yet they did not hesitate to renew the jugglery of Henry II, and again announced that they desired to fight for the religious liberty of the German Protestants. They had no other object than to rob Germany at a moment when it was too weak to defend itself. France acted like a thief that enters a burning city, not to extinguish the fire, but to steal. It had not the least right to interfere in German affairs. The people in Germany understood this very well, and made a great distinction between the Swedes and the French. It greeted King Gustavus Adolphus as a saviour. It cast itself upon its knees before him, and besought his blessing. In the so-called saviour, on the other hand, that came across the Rhine with French troops, in General Turenne, it saw only a robber and an incendiary. Thousands of public voices of that time, pamphlets, reports, and memorials spoke for the Swedes, not one for the French. Wearied at last by the long war, the German Empire finally had to surrender Alsace as booty to the French, with the exception of the imperial cities, particularly Strasbourg, which at that time were still left to us, but were surrounded with French troops and were exposed without protection to the pleasure of France. The flag of lilies was planted on the Rhine. The Rhine, at least part of the Rhine, was now the boundary of France. Can we call this, then, a natural boundary? In truth, one does not need to belong to the German nation, which was so injured, and so deeply wronged in its rights, in order to be convinced that France has come up to the Rhine only per nefas, that it never had a right either to make conquests in the German Empire, or even to interfere in the affairs of Germany. Germany was so worn out that France was enabled to continue its wicked game with little trouble. France's conquests in Germany did not cease with the Peace of Westphalia, but they were then first systematically begun. While Germany was still only an empire in name, but in fact a hollow heap of discordant and feeble states, Louis XIV in France brought all the provinces, classes and parties under his power, and created absolute monarchy in which everything was subservient to one will. This enabled him to levy immense taxes and to raise enormous armies, an expenditure of strength with which the neighbouring states in their feeble condition could not compete. This transformation of France under Louis XIV may justly be regarded as a Gallic-Roman reaction against the Germanic element, which had always been in force in France, as a destruction of the ancient Franconian liberties of the people and of state representation, as a return to the early Roman despotism such as had been customary in Gaul for 500 years, from the time of Caesar until that of Clovis. This explains also the great revolution in taste, in art and literature. The court of Louis XIV was surrounded with memories of Roman antiquity and with imitations of ancient art. Ancient mythology was brought to life again. Statues and pictures of ancient gods filled the palaces and gardens. The plays, operas, and poems were fashioned after this model. It was the Middle Ages of the Renaissance, the second birth of the Gallic-Roman spirit. But this spirit had none of the better pristine spirit of the Roman and Greek republics. Everything was derived from the base spirit of the later Roman Empire. It was godless, immoral, and heathen, despotic and servile. The French court wallowed in all the vices of the ancient world, and presented a scene of shameless public life, of which the people had no recollections, but which was referred to by scholars as classic, and was palliated. Unfortunately, Louis XIV also adopted the ancient Roman system of conquest, haughty contempt for all popular rights, and while he regarded himself as heir to the ancient Roman culture, it pleased him to see in the Germans again only barbarians, that he had a right to subject to himself by stratagem and force, just as Roman emperors had exercised the same right. It is true that French kings before him had pursued this policy, and had never regarded the rights of their German neighbours, but Louis XIV was much more systematic in this policy. The conquest of the world and the establishment of a universal French monarchy were always the dominant scheme of the French cabinet and of the French nation. Louis could inoculate the ancient Roman system into the body politic of Europe most conveniently if he himself was the German emperor. He was all in a position which made it possible for him to remove Germanic institutions gradually from the German Empire, as he did in France, and in their place to establish Roman despotic institutions, to convert the German emperor into an ancient Roman one, without being perceived, and to date back the empire, which up to this hour was reckoned from the time of Charlemagne to the time of Augustus. His influence in Germany was great, that the House of Habsburg had been enfeebled since the 30 Years' War, and the younger and somewhat more inactive Leopold did not seem to be an opponent against whom Louis should not have ventured to make this undertaking after the death of Ferdinand III. He did venture it. Although the circumstances were greatly in his favour at that time, yet he too failed at the imperial election, like all previous French kings. German princes often allowed themselves to be bribed by France, to be induced to commit open treason and revolt against emperor and empire, to accept pay in war, but they never surrendered themselves to favour France at the elections. In this respect they always preserved a certain pride, and displayed more stability than France expected. But they were not without perjury, for they first gave France reason to hope, and then deceived it. The intrigues at the election of Leopold I, by which his competitor for the German crown, Louis XIV, was excluded, are a web of the basest perjuries committed on all sides. In order to appease the anger of Louis XIV on account of his disappointed hopes, Prince John Philip of Mayence, the imperial vice-chancellor who had conducted the election, and his still more talented minister Boinenberg, united the elective act favouring German interests with a political act most injurious to those interests, namely the establishment of a Rhenish confederation against the German emperor and under the protectorate of France. Thus the diplomatic intriguers in Mayence hoped not to injure their cause either with the emperor or with France, and to keep their hands in the game. The weak emperor was satisfied with it, and he was very anxious to save the Mayence plotter. But Louis seemed to be extremely enraged. He terrified the electoral prince of Mayence, and forced him to cast himself unconditionally into the arms of France. Boinenberg, however, was not excused. Whatever he had done for Louis in establishing the Rhenish Confederation was ungratefully forgotten. That he had prevented the election of Louis at the imperial election was charged against him as the worst of crimes, and at the command of Louis XIV, John Philip, the German imperial vice-chancellor, ordered his minister Boinenberg to be arrested at the sitting of the Diet at Regensburg, and to be cast into prison. Louis's influence became still greater when he bribed the princes of the Rhenish Confederation with enormous sums of money annually, and almost all the princes of West Germany flocked hither in order to beg for large, yes, even small sums. Indeed, at the court of the emperor, Minister Lobkowitz, who was absolute in power, was bribed with French money. The great electoral prince of Brandenburg alone represented the honour and interests of Germany, and reproached the other princes for their treachery and their feebleness. Louis did not yet dare to attempt a direct attack upon the German Empire, in order to make any conquests in it, lest he should terrify the princes of the Rhenish Confederation, and again alienate them from him. He still needed them. In the second place, it all depended upon being certain of both the flanks of Germany, namely Switzerland and the Netherlands. If he succeeded in this, and he hoped to accomplish it by the means of this very Rhenish Confederation, he could then, without further regard for the latter, fall at once upon the German Empire. Switzerland he gained, as he had the Confederation, by bribery. An attack upon Switzerland would have been dangerous, and wholly superfluous. The Swiss offered themselves voluntarily to serve France, and in all his wars Louis had from 20 to 30,000 Swiss in his pay, who were always the foremost, and often alone decided a victory or prevented a defeat. Swiss diplomacy also served the French. The rulers of the Swiss Confederation were bribed by France. They did everything that France desired, hindered the movements of the emperor, opposed all demands of the German Empire, acted altogether as if Switzerland were a French province. Zurich alone struggled against France. The Swiss had lost all sentiment for German nationality, and yet they are German. All their political foresight had gone. As republicans they served a despot. As neighbours they strengthened a power which itself was destined, sooner or later, to be equally dangerous to them, and to all other neighbours. Had the Swiss fought for the German cause with their strong armies, France would never have been so powerful. Never did France gain an advantage over Germany, except by German arms, by the assistance of Germans who denied their own country. The Swiss were secured by cunning intrigue and money, and Louis now sought most of all to get possession of the Netherlands. King Charles Stuart II, who had been reinstated after a great revolution in England, surrendered himself completely to the French policy, and undertook to occupy the vigilant Hollanders by a combat on sea. The Spanish Netherlands, supported neither by Holland nor by the German Empire, were flooded with French armies and exposed their feebleness. The popular spirit had been impaired by the training of the Jesuits. Louis seized Arras, Edin, and a few other places from the Spanish Netherlands, and united them to France. No one took any notice of it. It was not yet time to capture all the Spanish Netherlands, as Louis wished to have Holland first. If this country were in his power, the southern Netherlands would naturally fall into his hands of their own accord. But in order to conquer Holland, he still had need of the French Confederation, which assured to him partly the alliance, partly the neutrality of the German Empire. He let spring all the diplomatic mines. The Confederation had to supply troops for him. The Emperor himself was induced by Lobkowitz to look upon the conquest of Holland peacefully, as the Hollanders, of course, were only Calvinistic heretics. The English also allowed themselves to be influenced by commercial jealousy to assist the French against Holland. Now Holland seemed to be lost, but the heroic uprising of the Hollanders and the skill with which they used their water power, opening the dikes and piercing the dams as a protection against their foe, prevented the triumphant journey of the 200,000 men whom Louis had led to the Scheldt. At the same time, the great Elector, Prince of Brandenburg, was eagerly striving to arouse the Empire to go to the assistance of Holland. The Emperor finally bestirred himself, and his general, Montecuccoli, despite the prohibitive order of Lobkowitz, was decidedly anti-French in his feelings. Louis no longer dared to take any extreme measures, and he left Holland in peace. But he revenged himself when he sent the Swedes into the territory of the great Elector, and allowed the Emperor to be annoyed by the Turks in the east. It is true that Louis called himself the most Christian king, but he did not hesitate to enter into a public alliance with the Sultan. While the great Elector and the Emperor were busied in another quarter, Louis again seized the Spanish Netherlands and the Austrian possessions on the Upper Rhine, and in order to prevent him from seizing more, the Spanish surrendered to him Burgundy, the free earldom, Franche-Comté, and 12 important Netherland towns, Tournai, Lille, Courtrai, etc. The Germans surrendered the city of Freiburg in Breisgau, which he converted into a French fortification. This happened at the Treaty of Nijmegen, Nijmweg, take away, people said it meant, in 1678. The great feebleness evinced by this surrender on the part of the German Empire incited the King of France to continue to make more impudent demands. He established the notorious Chambers of Reunion, which were obliged to record all former alliances with the German provinces and cities conquered by him, all of which he reclaimed at once as French property. The Emperor, being at that time sorely pressed by the Turks, could not ward off these new French depredations. German traitors assisted the French, and thus Strasbourg fell, which until the year 1681 had been the unassailable bulwark of Germany on the Upper Rhine. Since German historians have troubled themselves very little with more detailed accounts of this lamentable affair, we think it ought to be related here. We closely follow the excellent work of Friese, who published his History of Strasbourg from the year 1791 to 1795, in the midst of the storm of the Revolution, a work almost unknown in Germany, although it is written in good German spirit, and with great care. It ought to be known that the citizens of Strasbourg hated and feared to come under the rule of France more than anything else, that they had made the greatest sacrifices in order to fortify their city sufficiently, that they had frequently sought aid from the German Empire, and from the Swiss, their old allies, that they had never allowed themselves to be ensnared or tricked by the intrigues of Louis, that before their feet was laid the head of the lawyer, Obrecht, who had formerly planned to betray the city to France. But from all sides the French pressed hard upon Strasbourg. They hindered its trade, they impoverished it little by little, and drove it to despair. At the same time, Obrecht Jr., the son of the one executed, brooded revenge upon the honourable, resolute, German-minded chief magistrate, Dietrich, who had principally led to the discovery and the punishment of the former's father. Obrecht, with 300,000 imperial dollars entrusted to him by Louis XIV for this purpose, bribed the city secretary Gunzer and a number of other men, and while the most influential citizens of Strasbourg were absent visiting the fair at Frankfurt, Strasbourg was attacked by a large French force. Terrible threats on their part, and the intrigues of the traitors, the absence of the best citizens, and the impossibility of succour, the hopes of saving the ancient liberties of the city by a capitulation were effectual. The city was surrendered, and never since has the German flag floated upon its walls. Obrecht became a Catholic, and absolute governor of the King of France in Strasbourg. The fate of the noble chief magistrate, Dominicus Dietrich, is touching, and his memory ought not to have been so neglected, as is the case, for in what history of the German people has the tragic end of this patriot been mentioned? It is a hard lot to be a patriot in Germany, for he is forgotten. Dietrich was summoned to Paris and was retained there, lest a German party of opposition should be formed about him. Having detained him a long time, they thought that he had become humble, and they attempted to bribe him, in order that upon his return to Strasbourg he might preach French principles to his party. The notorious minister Louvois ordered him to be summoned, received him while reading his Bible, and said to him as follows: "The chief people of Antioch said to Matthias, 'Thou art the most noble and most powerful in this city, and hast many sons and many friends. Therefore enter thou first, and do what the king has commanded, as all lands have done, and the people of Judea that are still at Jerusalem. So shall thou and thy sons have a gracious king, and be endowed with gold and silver and great gifts.'" 1 Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. But Dietrich, being a good Lutheran and well versed in his Bible, answered on the spur of the moment. Then Matthias said, "Although all lands were obedient to Antioch, and every man deserted the law of his fathers, and consent to the command of the king, yet I, my sons, and my brothers are not willing to desert the law." The following verses. After that they made short work with him, and banished him to southern France, from which he was released when he had become an old man, and then, in order to die in Strasbourg. End of section 2.